into implementing Act 171, land use planning to address forest fragmentation. So please do feel free to use that questions toolbar and ask questions as we go along, and those will be read off at the end. Jamie, please let me pass things over to you.
Great, thanks, Jens. And thanks everybody for joining today's webinar. So here's a brief overview, the outline of today's presentation. So we're going to give you an introduction to the planning provisions in Act 171. And then we're going to walk you through a 5-step process of how you can go through the planning process in order to meet the obligations of the new requirements, new planning requirements. So you see the 5 steps here, which we'll be walking through in some detail, and then we'll provide you some resources at the end. So broad overview of the planning provisions of Act 171, and it's important to note that Act 171, which passed in 2016, was a forest omnibus bill. It had many different forest policy provisions in it, but we're going to explain those that relate to land use planning in Vermont. And so it added a new requirement to the state's land use planning goals to manage Vermont's forest lands so as to maintain and improve forest blocks and habitat connectors. And so now it requires towns and regional plans to indicate those areas that are important or require special consideration as forest blocks and habitat connectors, and to plan for development in those areas to minimize forest fragmentation and promote the health, viability, and ecological functions of forests. And we'll walk through those planning provisions with a little bit more detail in a minute. I also wanted to highlight that Act 171 also clarifies that a municipal bylaw may not regulate forestry operations. This was essentially the understanding, although it wasn't really clear, and so it's now in statute that forestry operations shall not be regulated by a municipal bylaw, and it provides a definition in the Act, which you have here on your screen at the bottom, of what a forestry operation means. I do want to quickly mention, though, that the section of the statute regarding a municipality's ability or lack of ability to regulate forestry operations does clarify that when issuing a decision on an application for land development, that the municipality may impose reasonable conditions to protect wildlife habitat, threatened or endangered species, or other natural, historic, or scenic resources, provided that a reasonable conditions do not restrict or regulate forestry operations unrelated to land development. So the key is, if you're regulating for land clearing related to land development, then there is a municipal role to play in regards to how trees are cut. If it's silviculture, that's under the jurisdiction of the state. Okay, so I've already mentioned this, but I just wanted to give you the statutory reference here at the top and put the new goal into context. That along with the existing planning goals that are already in statute for municipal and regional planning, there is now a new requirement under the goal of maintaining and improving the quality of air, water, wildlife, forest, and other land resources, to specifically require that Vermont's forest lands should be managed so as to maintain and improve forest blocks and habitat connectors. So that is the new goal there. Okay, and then in regards to municipal plans, as many of you are already familiar, the plan includes 12 elements. Many of those are related to natural resources, but now municipal plans or regional plans adopted after January 1 of 2018 must now include a map, and we'll talk later about where that map, how you should update the map. But that you should include a map that in your future land use map that identifies forest blocks and habitat connectors. And again, you just see here the relevant new language, which I've already mentioned, but you see it embedded in the statute here. Okay, and then the same for regional plans with the relevant new language, which essentially mirrors the language at the municipal level. It just references the Regional Planning Commission as having the authority now to incorporate this into the map. Okay, so the statute does provide some new definitions for forest block. to contiguous area of forest in any stage of succession and not currently developed for non-forest use. Jens will walk us through essentially how to identify these forest blocks, but I wanted to highlight here that a forest block may include recreational trails, wetlands, or other natural features. There's a definition for forest fragmentation provided in the statute. There's a definition for habitat connector, and I'd like to also highlight that a habitat connector may include recreational trails. So again, the legislature was deliberate that within these forest blocks and habitat connectors, part of the value of these forest blocks they are available for recreation. So recreation is seen as compatible within these areas. And also the legislature recognized that for many municipalities or regional planning commissions, they already were using certain terms for some of these features. And so wildlife corridor in particular can be used in lieu of habitat connector. And then recreational trail is defined, and that's a corridor that's not paved and used for these recreational uses that are in the statute. Again, the idea here is that if you have a recreational trail for these uses, it's not intended to be a fragmenting feature, meaning recreational uses along these lines are compatible with trying to maintain the forest blocks or habitat connectors. Okay, and then I wanted to briefly mention that when Governor Shumlin signed Act 171 in June of 2016, he directed the Agency of Natural Resources to work with ACCD in the published guidance to implement these planning provisions. That guidance is now available at this link. It is in draft form, but I just wanted to show you here that if you go to the link and then you go to this page, you can click on the draft guidance. We do expect that the agency will be finalizing this hopefully within the next couple of weeks, but it's available for you to see in draft format. And much of what we're going to be discussing today is available in more detail in this. And so if you're taking notes and you feel like you haven't captured everything, we just wanted you to know that you will have this as a reference. Okay, so I'm going to close that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Claire.
Great. So as part of this webinar, what we're going to be doing is providing an overview of the planning process. Many of you are already undertaking some of these steps already in your existing planning process, and we just wanted to highlight, this is a suggestion, that you can go through these steps as a way to help go through the process of meeting the requirements. This is the same steps that are outlined in the ACCD planning manual. And so Jens will be talking about undertaking a community assessment and developing a shared vision. And that then we'll also talk about identifying community goals and objectives. And then we'll also say how do you integrate, show you how to integrate that into your future land use plan, and to be able to then identify some actionable items within that planning process. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jens, who is going to talk about the community assessment.
And Claire, I just made you presenter, so if you could please make Jens the presenter.
Sure.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. So the first most important point to make here is that this was all brought about to celebrate forest and to celebrate this resource that we have across Vermont and all the different functions and values that forests bring to us. So I just wanted to get into that a little bit more and think about, okay, well, what are these benefits of large forests? Well, my starting point is always biological diversity. Large forest blocks are great for biological diversity, but they're also really important for scenery and clean air and clean water. They provide land for working forest, for the forest industry. They provide economic benefits associated with recreation and tourism. They prevent erosion and reduce flooding. Large forest blocks provide land for hunting, fishing, wildlife viewing, and that brings in a tremendous amount of money that I'll get to on my next slide. These large forest blocks transmit fewer tick-borne illnesses, and they grab carbon out of the air and keep it out of the global warming cycle. So we can think about all of these different functions, values, benefits of these large forest blocks. Forests also power the Vermont economy. We talk about the forest products industry adding $1.5 billion to the Vermont economy. That's 12% of Vermont's GDP, about 20,000 jobs. Fall foliage tourism is about 25% of the tourist income to Vermont. The hunting, fishing, and wildlife watching that I mentioned in the last slide accounts for $685 million to the Vermont economy. And intact wetlands and riparian areas help reduce damage from floods. And so there's a untold economic benefits in just that one function alone. So what we're really looking for with Act 171 is we're trying to meet multiple values at the same place at the same time. And generally speaking, with working forests, we can accommodate multiple values. We can have that wildlife habitat and still provide for working forests, to provide for that economic engine in our towns. The way we do that, the way we have our cake and eat it too, if you will, is by managing for ecological function. So making sure that the use of the land it supports the ecological function that's most important for that aspect of the landscape. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more here in the future, in the next couple slides. So earlier I had mentioned that biological diversity is one of the benefits of a large forest block. And so I just wanted to show you this chart here. Along the top we have huge forest blocks over to the left and very small forest blocks over to the right. And under each block size is the list of species that block is likely to sustain. This is actual research done in Maine, but the species list is very comparable to what we would see here in Vermont. So all things created equal, larger forest block is going to have much, much higher biological diversities, more species present, whereas a smaller forest block, like 1 to 20 acre forest, you're left with suburban species, squirrels, raccoons, skunks. So this overall pattern of larger forest blocks, more species diversity is really undeniable. But there have been significant changes to the pattern of our forests over time, and I just wanted to put that in motion for you and show you what that looks like. This is an aerial photo of Stowe in 1962. At left, you can see Route 100 cutting across the screen, and then that's the turn for Moscow Road. And what I've done is I've colored forest in green for each of the different years that I'll show you. So this is what I consider to be forest cover in 1962. And so I'd like you to keep an eye on both the upper part of this picture, the connection to the top of the image, and also on the left side, the connections to the left side across Route 100 there. So from my point of view, here in 1962, this forest block at center is still well connected to the north, east, west, south. This is a well-connected forest block. Yes, there are a few roads that set apart this forest block, but there's enough forest on both sides of that road that it remains pretty well connected. So let's see what happens over time. By 1974, we see those first roads have gone in. By 1980, a couple more. By 1996, we see that there's been a considerable amount of development on those roads. By 2007, there's been even more development. And by 2011, so the first thing I think you'll notice is, yes, there are some trees that aren't colored green. That's no longer, from the wildlife perspective, those trees are no longer part of a forest. They're a small patch of woods. They're less than 20 acres. They're completely surrounded by roads and development. So, so there are trees, but that's different than forest. The other thing that you'll notice is the connections, both to the north and to the west, have changed dramatically. The block at center is no longer a connected forest block. It is now much more isolated from the blocks around it than it was in the past. You might be interested that there's actually been no net loss of forest. There's been no change in the amount of green on these slides between 1962 and 2011. What's changed is the pattern of where those forests are. So keep that in mind, because it's an interesting story that really reflects the whole recent history of Vermont forest change. So the way we look at forests, and I encourage you to look at forests from an Act 171 perspective, we use a data set that's available on the A&R Atlas, on VCGI, and on BioFinder, called habitat blocks. But basically these are forest blocks. We call them habitat blocks because they're all types of natural cover. So they might include wetlands or some little bit of old field, but it's any type of natural cover surrounded by roads, development, and agriculture. And so at right, you see the picture statewide of these forest blocks. The darkest ones are the biggest ones. And so you see our basic pattern statewide is we have these large forest blocks along the spine of the Greens, and in the Northeast Kingdom. There are a few in the Piedmont, like Groton. That's the Worcester Range, if you can see my cursor. So there are a few forest blocks outside of the main spine of the Greens, but generally, we have the largest blocks right along a line from north to south. So that makes east-west movement much more difficult in Vermont. Let's just zoom in. I just zoomed into the Mad River Valley, and you see Wakefield, Fayston, and Warren. And so this is the same data set. Darker equals bigger. And so if you just look at Wakefield, you can see that there's a 20,000 acre block there to the east, part of the Northfield Range. And then they have a series of smaller blocks there in the valley. But please also notice that dark red block that just comes into the top left corner, the northwest corner of Wakefield. That's actually the tip of a 54,000 acre almost 55,000 acre. That's the Camel's Hump block. So you only understand the significance of that little chunk of forest in the northwest when you see it in this much bigger context. That's actually part of a huge forest block. So Wakefield has the large Northfield Ridge block that's 20,000 acres there to the right. A little bit of that 54,000 acre block in the northwest, and then some of the smaller blocks there in the valley. So when you zoom in, and now we're looking just at Wakefield. Again, you see that 20,000 acre block to the right, and the little tip at the extreme upper end of the photo is the little tip of that 54,000 acre block. But I just wanted to make the point, what I've done is I've added in surface waters and riparian areas. And so I just wanted to make the point that while when we just looked at just forests, it looked like there was a considerable amount of blank space there in Wakefield. But that's not actually blank space. Those are very important areas that's the Mad River and its tributaries. So the connection between layers is going to be a really important piece over during the course of my presentation. That we can't just look at forests as an isolated entity. We need to think about how those forests interact with the aquatic world and with other parts of the natural world. So here's a picture from also of Stowe, and right on the Stowe-Waterbury town line. And I just wanted to think about this photo for a second in the context of some of the large mammals that use this area. So the average black bear has a home range of more than 30 square miles. Moose have a home range between 10 and 20,000 acres. The average river otter has a home range between 15 and 30 linear miles, 15 to 30 linear stream miles. And bobcats in the Champlain Valley have a home range of 27 square miles. The males are moving on average about 19 miles per day. So you think about these animals moving around to get what they need at different times of the year. So down in the valley, it's going to be the wetlands are going to be the first plants to green up, and later in the fall, it's going to be along the ridges where you might get oak or beech nuts. So they're using different parts of this photo, different parts of this area to get what they need to meet their life needs. Different areas at different times of year. So if we think about this, well, it's not all created equal from the standpoint of the black bear. So at left, this is the same photo, and I've just taken one forest block, and that's the Mount Mansfield block. It's 72,000 acres. So you can see that there's a tremendous amount of space there for a few individuals. But we're not just trying to make it so a bear can cross the road. We're trying to allow for whole populations to interconnect. So we need to look at the larger picture. As you all well know, Route 108 is closed in the winter. There's limited truck traffic. The actual traffic there is confined mostly to daylight hours. So the block, the blue block that you now see on screen is now 32,000 acres. From a wildlife perspective, those blocks are well connected enough that this area is basically serving as if it were a 104,000 acre block. Because those blocks are so well connected, the far-ranging mammals can use parts of those different blocks to meet their life needs. Now let's look to the south and to the east. That's the Worcester Range block, and this is an area called Shutesville Hill, a connection between the Mount Mansfield block and the Worcester block. Now, if Shutesville Hill is a viable connection and it maintains easy movement or maintains possibility for easy movement for wildlife, well then this whole area we could add another 45,000 acres. So my point here is blocks that are well connected can behave as if they're much bigger than their acreage alone would suggest because they're well connected. So the idea here is this is what we don't want. This is the pattern we don't want of these isolated forest blocks. You see in the upper right of the image that forest block is completely isolated. It's not connected to the river and to the other habitat blocks that are lower in elevation. We can talk about that light green as barriers to animal movement. And there's all sorts of stuff in there. There are roads in there. And depending on the traffic volume and the traffic speed, those can be really significant barriers to wildlife. There's development in there, and there's agriculture in there. So all of those are potential barriers to wildlife movement. What we're looking to maintain, and I did say that correctly, maintain, we still enjoy a relatively connected pattern statewide. So what we're looking to maintain is connections from those upland blocks down to the river for those streamside vegetation to allow movement along the river, so that all of those different life needs that I spoke about for those far-ranging mammals can be met because they're all connected. So that black bear can move down to the river in the early spring and back up to the ridgeline later in the fall. Now, from the standpoint of a bobcat, I just wanted to speak to what this all looks like on the ground. So you can see this, the yellow dots are from a GPS collar of one of our collared bobcats a few years ago. And you can see where that bobcat has been spending most of its time. This is the northern end of Shelburne Pond. You can see that the cat's been spending a lot of time in these mixed conifers, the evergreens and hardwoods. You can see that he's gone into the wetland area, and maybe that was in the winter when it was frozen solid, or stayed over to the edge where it was a little drier. But look at this. From the bobcat's perspective, the short distance between the high-quality habitat of Shelburne Pond and the high quality forest block over to the right-hand side of the photo, it was the connection, it was sufficient to have just a hedgerow and a line of trees that connects those two blocks for that short hop. So the most micro scale of this idea of habitat connectivity is going to depend on the species. But from this bobcat perspective, over the short distance from Shelburne Pond to that forest block, this amount of cover was sufficient. Just following that tree line was sufficient cover to allow for connectivity. Now, again, that's going to look different for different species, but here's that concept I'm trying to get you to understand, is that most micro scale of habitat connectivity. If we zoom out, we can also think about connectivity at a much bigger scale. Now, I said earlier that we're trying to connect populations. Populations that have genetic diversity are more likely to withstand disturbance than populations that become increasingly inbred. So we're looking for a pattern where whole populations, where an individual can move from one population to another population, add to the genetic diversity, and make that new population healthier. So what I have on screen is from BioFinder, and that's really where we recommend you get data for Act 171 purposes. And in BioFinder, and I'm going to go through a few more BioFinder slides for you in the coming minutes, but what you see on screen is these connectivity blocks. And this is that a more macro scale of connectivity, where we're talking about where the large forests in the Sutton Mountains of Quebec connect to the Adirondacks, connect to the Berkshires in Massachusetts, connect to the White Mountains of New Hampshire. How does that happen? It happens through these areas in the dark brown and the light brown in Vermont. So BioFinder offers this connectivity blocks, this statewide picture of a connected landscape, of how that movement connects. Now, please bear in mind, connectivity blocks is a subset of the habitat or forest blocks that I just showed you. So we've chosen from all the forest blocks in Vermont, what the connectivity blocks is a selection of those that form this connected network, that are most important, highest priority, and priority for that particular value in mind. There's another set of forest blocks that were selected for their interior forest conditions, and I'll get to those in a second. But this really gets at that concept of genetic connectivity and how we maintain that. It's through these places on the ground. So here's that same network of highest priority connectivity blocks, and you can see it statewide here, that it truly does link north to south and also east to west. The best connection is through the southern Champlain Valley, across the Champlain Valley, and then also up here through what we call the Worcesters to Northeast Kingdom. So there's a whole statewide perspective of what connectivity looks like. We can also think about it on the scale of the entire northern Appalachians. So the blobs that you see on screen are not deep, dark forests in and of themselves. They're places that connect those core forests. So over here, in between the brown and the blue, for example, is the whole Adirondacks, a massive forest acreage. And then the blue is the connecting lands, the Adirondacks to Green Mountains linkage area that connects those. So these blobs have been identified by the Staying Connected initiative from this eco-regional binational perspective as eco-regionally significant connectivity areas. And you can really see how many of them are in Vermont. So we often affectionately call Vermont the crossroads of habitat connectivity because of what a key role it plays in connecting the Adirondacks, the Whites, the Blue Mountains of Maine, the Suttons in Quebec, and the Berkshires. So all of these different scales from a connectivity perspective matter. This statewide perspective is built on these local road connections. And this eco-regional perspective is built on this statewide network. And all three of these different scales are incredibly important in connectivity. And so we're going to use slightly different data sets within BioFinder to get you the information that you need for your town-based Act 171 planning. So when you first bring up BioFinder, the map portion of BioFinder, it looks like this. So the website is down here, biofinder.vermont.gov, and then you'll click on a link that takes you to the map portion. And you can see when you first begin that it shows what we call Vermont conservation design, this dark green and light green. I'll explain that in a second. But BioFinder is great whether you're doing forest planning for Act 171 or whether you're just interested in how your woodlot connects and to a larger in a larger context, or what resources are present there. So I just said that the BioFinder has these priority rankings, these highest priority and priority rankings, and where did that come from? Well, Vermont Conservation Design is a new suite of data that's present in BioFinder, and again, it really focuses in on this idea of ecological function, the ability of plants and animals to interact as needed in order to thrive, reproduce, migrate, and move, even as the climate changes. So Vermont Conservation Design and BioFinder are not just looking at current biological diversity, but we're also looking at biological diversity into the future. What is the resilient landscape? What are the parts of our forest and aquatic networks that are going to be able to withstand change as the climate changes? So that, again, here's that first screen of BioFinder, and you can see this highest priority and priority designation statewide. And we're just going to pursue two different case studies. One of them is Wakefield, the red on the right, and the other one is Harrisburg, the red outline town on the left. And so from the statewide perspective, just looking at the highest priority and priority at this landscape scale, you can see that there's something of a hole in the middle of Wakefield, but you can also see that it's part of this massive north-south connection and this area of highest priority along the spine of the greens that looks, and then on the Northfield range, that both look pretty significant. By contrast, just at this landscape scale, you can see that Harrisburg has very fragmented forest blocks, and yet it's very well connected in the aquatic sense through streams and rivers up into the Lake Champlain Basin. So very different landscape contexts, but both have received this highest priority ranking. In one case, we have a lot more forest. In another case, we have a lot less. So if we zoom into Wakefield, again, this is that same map showing the highest priority and the priority at the landscape scale. You see that whole 20,000 acre block on the Northfield Range on the right with the highest priority. There are a bunch of other highest priority values areas here spotted around town. But we can also layer in species and community scale. Again, just the rankings for now, these highest priority and priority rankings, and they can give you an idea of some of the parts of these blocks that might be particularly important for resources at these smaller scales. So this is a way that you might help you to figure out how if one forest block is potentially more important than another because of the presence of these other species and community scale elements. So the BioFinder allows you to drill down. So with a simple click for either the landscape or the species and community scale, you get this list of all the suite of components that is present. So in this case, I'm listing all these highest priority components and these priority components at the species and community scale. And so just a simple click in BioFinder shows you what that suite of components is. So first you know that it's highest priority, it's dark green. Then you click and you figure out, okay, well, what are the parts of that? What are the components that are present? And in that Harrisburg example, it's more riparian area surface waters. And in that Wakefield example, it's more interior forest and connectivity blocks. So again, I'm back at Wakefield, and I mentioned earlier that there are different selections of forest blocks for different values. And so what I have on screen now are the interior forest blocks. So again, a selection of the habitat blocks that were deemed most important for this value, this function of being interior forest, the deep dark woods. And then I layered in on top the highest priority surface waters and riparian areas, the main stem of the Mad River down along the middle. So from an Act 171 planning perspective, this is good. This is your basic, your first step at coming up with recognizing your forest blocks. You can just go on to BioFinder, open up the individual landscape scale components, turn on the interior forest blocks, and you'll get your first crack at what's present in your town that is a statewide perspective. Remember, there are other forest blocks in here, but they don't serve for that highest priority interior forest function. So anyway, this is the good version, that most basic set of data that you could use for your planning. I'm going to explore a couple more. But first, I wanted to just bring you back to this concept of wildlife road crossings. So what I have on screen, again, is that highest priority and priority from the landscape scale, but then I put on over top these highest priority wildlife road crossings. And so at that micro scale of connectivity, you get a sense that this area in the northern part of Wakefield, those road segments really do contribute to this larger connected pattern. Some of the ones in the central part of Wakefield strike me as a little bit off the mark. So I show you this intentionally to say that you might need to sort through some of this data, and bringing in the community wildlife program that I work with, Monica Presbahart works with, we can help you do that so that you can fine-tune the set of wildlife road crossings or the set of forest blocks that you want to include in your Act 171 planning. So it might take a little bit of selecting the most appropriate elements in your work for 171 planning. So I think this map is a better indication, is the better version of what you should include for Act 171. I showed you the good version before, which is just those interior forest blocks. But as I mentioned, just looking at forest isn't sufficient, because we need to consider how that forest interacts with the aquatic world, how there are connections between lower elevation and higher elevation, where there are rare plants. So we want to do our forest planning in the context of all the natural heritage elements, all of the different parts of biological diversity, so that we can manage for ecological function. So a better version for Act 171 planning might be to look at this map and look at those landscape scale priorities, because they include more than just interior forest blocks. In particular, this area is a smaller, perhaps you see the dark gray circle I just put in over top. That area is important not only for being a smaller forest block, but also because of those connections, those wildlife road crossings that I showed you a second ago. And then that area up there, remember, that's that little tip of that 54,000 acre Camel's Hump block. So it barely shows up in Wakefield, but that's how you connect the Northfield Range to the Camel's Hump block, is through that part of Wakefield. So that winds up being an incredibly important spot. And then lastly, you can see that BioFinder has looked at this stream segment as very important, again, for that east-west connectivity, as well as those surface water and riparian area functions. So again, I think use of BioFinder at the landscape scale is a better way to do forest block planning. I'm going to show you a third scenario here in a couple slides. So many towns have done have paid for an inventory, a natural community map, a more detailed field inventory of what's in their town. And you shouldn't hesitate to use this type of data in your Act 171 planning, because there's a lot of very valuable information in these local inventories, and not everything that's important at the local level shows up in BioFinder as being of statewide significance. So again, I'm sticking with this Wakefield case study, and Wakefield and Fayston together did pay for an inventory in 2007 from Arrowwood. And the Fish and Wildlife Department and Vermont Natural Resources Council and a variety of partners worked very hard with the Mad River Valley Planning District to take that data, to wrestle with it, and transform it into this map. It's the tiered ecological priorities. And what we've done here is we've forced different natural heritage components into different categories. A primary conservation area, the highest, what should be the highest regulatory standard, thou shalt not touch sort of places from our ecological standpoint. A secondary conservation area, the dark orange, and a tertiary conservation area, the lighter orange. So a map like this might be the best example of what you could do for Act 171 planning. Because here we've taken forest blocks and we've prioritized them, but we've even prioritized places within an individual forest block as of higher significance or lower significance. So of the good, better, best, you know, this map represents some translation from that science, that raw science of what could be most important into the planning language of where we would put our priorities. So interestingly, I just did some calculations on what percentage in Wakefield, what percentage of the dark red, the orange, and the yellow were already not developable under current regulations. So you see that this is just for Wakefield, and you see at the far right, percent of this conservation class not developable under town's current zoning and regulation. And 68% of that dark red primary conservation area is already not developable. So there's a tremendous amount of consensus already on a lot of what's most important in a lot of these areas. And that's, you know, that's great news. You know, from my ecological standpoint, I'd love to see that number closer to 100. But this is a great sign that of just how much work has already been done here. And it's really not just in Wakefield. Towns across Vermont have been doing forest planning for a long, long time. And Act 171 is just this most recent example, formalization of the process. So I just quickly wanted to jump to Harrisburg and show you these the highest priority interior forest blocks, or interior habitat blocks, from in Harrisburg from BioFinder, and just, you know, it shows just how fragmented the landscape in the Champlain Valley is. But when we add in when we look at Harrisburg, again, from this BioFinder perspective at the landscape scale, just of highest priority and priority, you see how the surface waters and riparian areas tie together these forest blocks. So again, in a place like Harrisburg, it makes more sense to do that forest planning in the context of a larger suite of heritage components, and not just look at the isolated forest blocks, because it's the riparian areas, it's that streamside vegetation that connects those forest blocks together. So lastly, so that's what I just showed you was step one, that assessment phase, and I just wanted to move into step two, this developing a shared community vision piece. And the department does help with this, and one of the tools we use is called community value mapping. Of course, regional planning commissions are very active in this step, and there are a variety of partners that you can utilize to get more information on how you develop a shared community vision. This is just one tool I wanted to throw out there called community value mapping. And what we do is we get as many people together from town as possible. We divide them up into small groups with a base map, and we ask them, what do you love about living in your town? And they draw areas, they circle areas. We love the quiet here, we love the ATVing or the cross-country skiing there, we love the community feel of our main street and downtown, whatever it is. And then we force those into different value groups, and then we can overlap them. So the map you see at right is from that same community values mapping for Jericho, Bolton, Richmond, and Huntington that I've just shown you a picture of. And the darker colors indicate areas where there's more overlap, more different values present on the landscape. And the lighter green are areas where there's just one or two values. So from an ecological perspective, this shows you, again, where we might be able to have our cake and eat it too, where we might meet multiple values on the same place at the same time. And so we can begin to layer in not only those ecological priorities that I've been showing you from BioFinder, but we can layer in those community values and begin to find where there's consensus in our community for moving some type of conservation action forward. Here is the overlap, just because we've been hitting the Wakefield example pretty hard. This is a map of the community values overlap with the large forest blocks, in the Mad River Valley, what they call contiguous habitat units. And so the contiguous habitat units, the forest blocks, are that crosshatch, and then again the community values is that heat map with darker being more values present. And you can see that there is a tremendous amount of correlation between the big forest blocks in Wakefield, the Northfield Range there, and that connection on the northern part of town down to the Mad River. But you can also see the importance of suite of values right along the Mad River. So it's pretty interesting to be able to spatially correlate ecological values with these community values as a way of moving your planning process forward. So all of this is to say, from our perspective, we're trying to help communities have a healthy ecology as the backbone for a healthy economy and healthy community. These three concepts are tightly interwoven in Vermont communities, and we're trying to do all that we can to promote that healthy ecology so that the economy and the community can all flourish. On the subject of the natural resource piece, or interpreting the data, there are two documents or two books that I'll point you to. On right is Conserving Vermont's Natural Heritage. Many of you probably already have it. That's the best source of information about the individual pieces of the ecosystem. So what is a forest block? Why is it important? Go to the Green Book. What is connectivity as a concept? How are those blocks mapped? Go to the Green Book. At left is a new document the Fish and Wildlife Department is publishing and should be published early in 2018. And it is the step-by-step of how to take data and do a comprehensive prioritization for town land use planning. How to take all the different pieces of the ecosystem, from large forest blocks to small rare species, and come up with a prioritization to move forward in your land use planning. So that'll be a very useful document to you all in this step-by-step of how do you get the data and what does it mean. Okay, so that's all I have for my section. At this point, I'm just going to turn it back over to Jamie Fidel. Thank you all for your time.
Okay, thanks, Jens. Okay, so now what do you do with the maps and the identified community values or community input that you've received? So we're recommending that the next step in the planning process is to update the mapping information in the natural resources map that you may have for your town plan or your regional plan. So you may update existing natural resource maps that you have, or you may create a natural resource map that has the identified forest blocks and habitat connectors, and potentially some of the overlapping ecological values that Jens walked you through. Once you have the maps, then you really want to round out that first step of the assessment. And as is outlined in the ACCD 5 steps in the planning manual, and also in the Act 171 guidance that will be forthcoming from the A&R, is that you do want to round out that assessment by analyzing the conditions of the forest and the opportunities for the forest and threats to the identified forest blocks and habitat connectors. And then consider updating the natural resource and or land use chapters of your town, your municipal or your regional plan. And that's rounding it out with the language about the conditions of the forest, and there's sample language in the A&R guidance about the condition of Vermont's forest, the benefits that forests provide, and some of the threats that forest blocks and habitat connectors are facing. Doing this provides the foundation for any policy and action steps that your community will choose to take later on. Okay, so then the next step is this step 3, and that's identifying the goals and policies. So Vermont state land use goals provides a good starting point for thinking about, excuse me for 1 second, for thinking about community goals for forest blocks and habitat connectors. So the goal that I mentioned before, the new goal, is one that you may want to rely on, that forest land should be managed so as to maintain and improve forest blocks and habitat connectors. So the communities or regions do have the authority to use the same language as this statewide goal. But with that in mind, really the first step is to review the existing plan goals and assess how well they're addressing this state planning goal. So for many communities or regions, they may already have goals related to forest and potentially minimizing forest fragmentation, maintaining habitat connectivity. So do an initial assessment. Is the existing language that's in the town or regional plan, is it already consistent with this new state goal? As a second step, then either update the existing goals or write new goals to help achieve the purpose in statute under Act 171. And so here's 3 examples of goals that could be included in a town or regional plan. And this would be language that would be consistent with the new statutory planning requirements. So then once you have identified your goal or goals for your forest blocks and habitat connectors, then it's time to really develop your draft policies. And so up here is, again, the reference language at the top here, that really the goal is to plan for development in these areas that have been identified to minimize forest fragmentation and promote the health, viability, and ecological function of forest. And in addition, the statute provides, as we mentioned before, that the plan may include specific policies to encourage the active management of forest blocks and habitat connectors for wildlife habitat, water quality, timber production, recreation, or other values or functions identified by the municipality. And this really shows the range of uses that can be compatible with the broader state goal, managing Vermont's forest lands to maintain and improve forest blocks and habitat connectors. And it shows that it's really, there's wide latitude for municipalities and regional planning commissions to decide on which policies are right for their own community or region. And so, here are just a couple of draft ideas. One community might, for example, focus on landowner incentives as a policy, that the town will support landowners working to reduce the fragmentation of important forest blocks and habitat connectors through, let's say, enrollment in the current use program or conservation efforts that landowners may undertake. Other potential policies, like the one that Montgomery has already in its town plan, that development shall be designed and sited in a manner to limit the fragmentation of large blocks of contiguous forest to the greatest degree possible. Underneath this, you can see an approach that the Two Rivers Ottaquechee regional planning, regional commission has taken in their regional plan. And included in that is some language specifically about corridors connecting habitat areas for large mammals must be incorporated into plans for management and conservation of forest areas, and fragmentation of important areas should not be approved. And then finally, as you will see in the forthcoming A&R guidance, there are also the sample policies. These are not from a specific municipality, but these are the kind of policies which you could potentially choose or modify if you wanted to address encroachment into interior forest blocks by either trying to shape development more on the outside edges of the block and to reduce or minimize the fragmentation into the interior areas of the block, or perhaps approach it from policies related to roads of a certain distance being prohibited in the forest block. And similar approaches here articulated for consideration in regards to habitat connectors as well. So the really identifying and articulating the goals and potential policies prepares you for step 4, which involves thinking about what should be taking place where on the land. And then later, the goals and policies will be integrated into the natural resource and land use elements. And so with that, I am going to turn this over to Claire.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm just waiting for you to make me a presenter.
There you go.
There we go. Excellent. Thank you. So as we've seen this slide before, what we're laying out here today is a suggested approach that you may take on to help go through identifying, those forest block areas and how you can be meeting the goals of Act 171. As I mentioned, this approach is presented in ACCD Municipal Planning Manual, and I did want to note that within the most recent updated version of that planning manual that is dated April of 2017, in the back under the required elements for a municipal plan and the state goals does include that new language. So that can be a resource. If you have that planning manual, you can just refer to the appendix, and there is that statutory language there. And so as we're going through this process, I just wanted to do a quick overview of kind of where we've come to so far in this presentation. Jens has talked about step 1, which is the community assessment, and also talking a little bit about developing that community vision. And Jamie's talked about identifying the goals and setting out some policies for forest blocks and wildlife connectors. And how this comes together in your town plan, once again, we're using Wakefield as an example. Here you can see the map that is from the Wakefield Town Plan, and this is one of their natural resources maps, where they've mapped a variety of different natural resources within that chapter. Within that chapter also includes the status of the forest blocks. It also talks about some of the threats and opportunities, and then within that natural resource section, it does associate and identify some goals and policies. So if we were to look at some of those ones that are included in this plan, you can see that in Wakefield they've included a plan, a goal, which states that there'll be responsible stewardship and sustainable use of Wakefield's natural resources. They've also identified some policies there that go along with that, where they're saying that they want to identify and protect important natural resources, including significant wildlife habitat. Similarly, another policy that they've included in their town plan is saying that they want to support the local efforts of regional and statewide conservation groups. And they've set out a few priorities for open space protection, which includes areas in high elevation land above 1,500 feet in the Northfield range, and they've also identified the need to protect significant wildlife habitat and travel corridors. And what I wanted to mention here is that this is a great opportunity to work in collaboration with a local conservation commission. The local conservation commission could help with some of these efforts in identifying these areas or identifying some of the priorities that then could be considered by the by the Planning Commission. So as we move on to the next step is taking that information that's been gathered through that assessment process, and as you remember, under state statute under section 4382, the plan for the municipality, one of the requirements for a town plan is that it include a land use plan, which will consist of a map and statement of present and prospective land uses. To add on to that, Act 171 specifically adds that within that land use plan, you have to indicate those areas that are important as forest blocks and habitat connectors, and that plan may also include specific policies. So just to touch upon that land use plan, and as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this information is contained within that ACCD planning manual. So that future land use plan is both a map and a statement of policies on existing and proposed land uses. The map that's included graphically communicates the important components of a community's vision for change, and that map doesn't necessarily reflect current uses, but rather the uses desired. So it's a forward-thinking map. The map is not a zoning map, but it does establish the basis for a zoning map, and that the land use classifications can be broad. So where you might be identifying large areas for conservation, or maybe you're identifying an area for a downtown area, once it comes to actually implementing your zoning map might actually have multiple zoning districts within that identified broader land use classification of a downtown that's been identified in your town plan. I've included here kind of a bubble diagram or a bubble map that was used in Richmond as basically a draft land use map to be considered by the municipality. And there you can see that they've identified some just areas, and it's quite conceptual. That land use map can be conceptual, and it is not a zoning map. So as you're looking at creating that land use plan or future land use plan, I think we've been using those terms somewhat interchangeably, that process would require kind of looking at your natural resource map. You want to look at your existing land uses and your zoning, and then you want to be able to incorporate what that vision for the future is and what the goals are that you've established for your town. And that future land use map is going to be that graphic representation in addition to policy language, which is going to set out that balance between where future growth will happen and how you'll go about resource protection in a town. You may want to look at your town plan. Your town plan may already include something along the lines of a conservation district or a natural resource area or a forest reserve. I think it's a forest preserve on the slide, but we've seen a forest reserve area in some towns. And it may be looking at that existing designation in your future land use plan and looking how well those areas line up with some of the identified forest blocks. So while it may not mean that you're having to create new areas, it may be that you're having to modify some of the existing areas that are already in your land use plan. So just to give an example of the difference between these different maps, here again we can see the natural resource map from the Wakefield town plan on the left side of the screen, and on the right side of the screen is their future land use map. You can see how they've taken that large area that's been identified as a wildlife habitat area, and we also saw that area identified in the maps that Jens had shown us, and that's the Worcester Range, and that's where there's a large habitat area and a forest block. You can see how they've taken that area from their natural resource map, and then they basically translated it onto their future land use map. You'll see that the lines don't exactly line up, but they've had to make some decisions. They've had to incorporate some of the future land uses, some of the existing land uses, and I believe part of the designation for this forest reserve area that you see on the future land use map on the right was that they identified an elevation line, and that elevation line was specifically identified in some of their policies as an area that they wanted to protect that land that is above 1,500 feet. So if we were to look more closely at the Wakefield town plan, within their land use chapter, they have a map that we've seen, And then they've also identified that specific area that's colored in green as a forest reserve district. So they've identified or defined that forest reserve district in part as all land with an elevation of 1,500 feet and above. Within that description, they've also identified that the distinguishing features of that forest reserve district include large tracts of productive forest land, and according to the Vermont Biodiversity Project, extensive areas of core wildlife habitat. So here they're referencing that they've drawn some of that data from that more localized or regional natural resources inventory that was done for the Mad River Valley. The land use plan goes on to state what types of compatible uses are encouraged within that particular district. So another segment or excerpt from the Wakefield Town Plan in their Forest Reserve District goes on to say that in order to limit the adverse impacts of additional residential development in this district, the upgrade of roads and subdivision of large forest parcels should be discouraged. So with that, we're kind of moving forward onto step 5, is that you're taking all that information within your town plan, and it's recommended or suggested that then you lay out an implementation program within your town plan. And there's an opportunity to lay out all your goals, policies, actions, and identify specific groups and a timeline as to when these actions would actually happen, so that it helps guide taking that plan and actually focusing it on the actual implementation actions. So this is actually a page out of the Harrisburg town plan, and here you can see they have this matrix that's basically outlining their implementation plan, where they're identifying their goals. Here you can see on the left side of the screen, in the middle is a goal that they've already identified, saying that they want to provide connectivity among natural areas and core wildlife habitat. They've identified a specific action, and I've highlighted one here you can see in yellow, where they're saying that when they're reviewing new development in Harrisburg, they want to strongly discourage development in key corridor linkage areas. They've identified the lead group to be able to implement this action as a development review board. And what I actually heard from Jens recently was that he was out there working with the town of Harrisburg to actually start working on this particular action item. Another way that you can help sketch out your your implementation strategy plan within your municipal plan. This example is from the ACCD planning manual, and this one's organized a little bit differently. Here they've organized it around the different areas of their land use plan. So for example, they have an action item which says that they want to hold public meetings on land conservation. They're saying that they want to target those public meetings in their agricultural and conservation district, and that they've identified that the Conservation Commission will be the lead group to help ensure that action item is actually implemented. So that gives you some ideas on how you can take all this information and bring it together to help really guide and implement your municipal plan. So I'm now going to hand it back over to Jamie. He's going to talk a little bit more about some of those specific actions that you can be considering for the preservation of forest blocks.
Okay, thanks, Claire. So really just wanted to highlight that there are various approaches or strategies that you have to consider in regards to the identified action steps that you'll put into your implementation plan. And they can be non-regulatory, solely non-regulatory action steps. They could be regulatory in nature or a combination of the two. I'm going to go fairly quickly through these options because they are all articulated in the A&R guidance, and also another document, an implementation guide, which VNRC put together, which I'll reference in a later slide. But this is just an example of some of the non-regulatory actions that you could consider identifying in your implementation plan. For example, promoting the use value appraisal program and encouraging landowners to enroll by hosting, let's say, a workshop as a potential action step with the county forester, so forest landowners can meet with the county forester and understand what kind of benefits come from enrolling in the current use program, the property tax benefits that come along with that. You could also identify as an action step encouraging landowners and forest blocks and habitat connectors to have management or conservation plans. And that could be done through the current use program, or it could be done through putting a conservation easement on their property, which again has another mechanism or tool that brings potential tax benefits to a landowner. And so one action step could be to provide a workshop or two for landowners to learn more about conservation easements. Another potential non-regulatory action step would be establishing a town forest, and to use it as an opportunity to showcase model sustainable forest management and also to protect forest values in the town. And then another potential non-regulatory approach would be supporting forest products industries in the town. And that can be done through a number of different mechanisms, but also has a relationship also on the regulatory side, where if you're going through your subdivision review process, you may want to have some standards which would try and maintain access to working lands, a viable access to those areas when you're doing your subdivision. Another potential option is to convene workshops for landowners to learn about succession planning, which is now identified as one of the real threats to forest fragmentation in the state because of the aging demographic of forest landowners. 15% of forest landowners in Vermont are over the age of 75, and there's projected to be about 17% transfer of forest land of parcels 10 acres or larger in the next 5 years. So it's anticipated there's going to be a shift, and have those forest landowners thought about who's going to inherit the land and how's that land going to be managed. And so perhaps going through some kind of planning process so that it doesn't just, the default isn't necessarily subdivision, especially for landowners that are within these important forest blocks or connector areas. And then there's some regulatory options, obviously, to consider as action steps. Establishing a resource protection district, like Clara was highlighting in Wakefield, is one example. A forest reserve district could also be a conservation district or an overlay district. These are all under the existing authority of towns to look at through and implement through their zoning, but you could identify it as an action step to consider. Incorporating development review standards in zoning bylaws to better address forest and wildlife resources. So that could be done through the site review standards or conditional use standards, and those could be specific standards to try and reduce levels or minimize levels of forest fragmentation in connectivity areas or in forest blocks. And then there's other options here on the left to consider. Creating or updating subdivision regulations. 50% of towns have subdivision regulations, 50% don't. So one step could be to actually have subdivision regulations, or then if you do have subdivision regulations, to update them to address forest fragmentation, or encouraging clustering through plan unit developments, investigating feasibility of alternatives to maximum lot size to guide development, so that if you have large lot sizes in rural areas, you may want to have some standards that accompany them to minimize the fragmentation of forest blocks, and also to review and strengthen local road policies to reduce forest fragmentation. For example, roads of a certain length may trigger some heightened level of review, or to look at how you're classifying trails and roads. So class 4 roads, potentially some could be reclassified to trails in some of these areas, or look at whether they're moving into a reclassification of something that would actually promote more development, of being mindful of those kind of policies. So these are all action steps that you could identify, among others that you could certainly consider, but you should go through a prioritization process, because obviously there's only so many action steps that you'll be able to identify and actually implement. So as you're going through that implementation plan, you could consider some of these questions that are outlined here. Again, this will all be incorporated in the A&R guidance, and so you could use that as a reference, just to give you a bit of a flavor of what's possible in the process you'll go through to prioritize And I mentioned before that we have this guidebook that's available on VNRC's webpage. It's actually the implementation steps that you would take. So you could look at this as a potential menu of potential action steps that you could identify in your implementation plan. And so that is available for you to go understand more of the details behind some of those strategies. But then obviously that's something you would get into through your actual implementation phase, which is outside of the planning phase. Once you've done your planning, then you're involved in your implementation. But here we just wanted to kind of bring you full circle to these steps that we've walked you through. So as next steps, we've referenced some documents that are available for you, or which will be coming out very soon. Within the Agency of Natural Resources, you have BioFinder and the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Jens and Monica at the Community Wildlife Program to help you with the mapping and the prioritization. There's also the A&R guidance document where we showed you the link to that. That will be finalized very soon, which walks you through all these steps, in the ACCD planning manual, which is something that you would already rely on anyway for your planning process. The Vermont Regional Planning Commissions are available to help you at the municipal level. We at VNRC also are available to help with technical assistance and land use planning, and we have our community strategies guide, which I just showed you. And then there's another project that's funded right now, and that's a 3-year project to actually develop some one-stop shopping to actually look at all the different resources that are available and putting them into one place for the Act 171 planning process. And obviously, along the way, we'd love to hear from you all about ideas you're thinking about that we may have not raised today, but of course may be great solutions or strategies in order to implement Act 171. So with that, we want to thank you for participating. Here's our contact information, and we did want to carve out a little bit of time here to answer questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. And if Claire and Jens want to go ahead and unmute themselves, I'll start going through questions that we have received, and we'll see what you guys have to say. So Melinda says, at the beginning you stated that this was during Jens's presentation, and it says at the beginning you stated trails are not fragmenting features. I'm wondering if there is some threshold of trail density beyond which trails will start to fragment the landscape. What is that threshold, and how do we determine it?
I'll start, and from my perspective, we were talking about how the mapping was done, and so the habitat blocks data set doesn't treat trails as a fragmenting feature. It treats class 3 roads as a fragmenting feature, but not class 4 roads or trails. That said, I think trails and class 4 roads can certainly become a vector for increased fragmentation or increased development, and then hence fragmentation. But I don't have any specific numbers on a certain density, trail density, where it becomes a fragmenting feature. You would see that happen in the land cover data set, which is based on a 30-meter pixel. When if you got to a sufficient density of trails, it would change that pixel over from being forest to being some other class of development. Yeah, I don't have I don't have a specific threshold for trails.
Okay. The next question from Michael is that he would be interested in some discussion of neotropical migrants and forest block size. Yeah, well, certainly, the point is well taken that forest blocks in Vermont are important, not just for the biological diversity that we have here in Vermont year-round, but also for species that spend part of their time here. And within the forest block mapping, the best way that we've gotten at that, and this is going to sound odd, but the best way that we've gotten at that is through the concept of physical landscape diversity. And you'll see that in BioFinder. There's a better correlation between geology and biological diversity than you might expect. So at this coarsest scale, places that have diversity in the in the physical landscape
also have biological diversity, and so and will into the future. So while I'm not specifically addressing neotropical migrants, I am just saying that overall, places that are diverse in the physical landscape are going to hold more biological diversity, including neotropical migrants. That would be one of the ways that we incorporate species beyond just our year-round species into the forest block modeling.
Okay. Darren asks, how should towns plan for these habitat blocks to change over time, especially as incremental development cuts off certain high priority areas? Can or should a town have a say in a neighboring town's actions related to forest connectivity, or how will the state manage that?
I will just take the first part of that and then hand it over to Jamie or Claire. But from my perspective, you know, if we manage for ecological function, we can expect some changes in these forest blocks over time that may not degrade the quality of that function. So if you're thinking about the function of interior forest, the deep dark woods, that home for biological diversity, well then you would expect to see a little bit of development around the edges of the forest block, but not into the middle of it. So I think, and if we do it right, then you wouldn't have a lot of change in connectivity areas, the crossings between blocks, and not in the middle. So that would be sort of my first stab at looking at how the block might change over time and still maintain ecological function. As for the second part of that, Jamie, Claire?
Yeah, I guess I kind of wanted to mention the town plan approval process. All neighboring towns are sent notice when a neighboring town is updating their town plan and going through that public hearing process. So there is a level of notice that the neighboring towns get when the town is going to be making changes, and there's an opportunity to be able to see what your neighbors are doing and be able to provide comments to the neighboring town. Similarly, in the process when a town plan is seeking confirmation of their municipal planning process and requesting regional planning approval, there is an opportunity there in a public hearing process where neighboring towns can weigh in. And so there is an aspect of that built into the approval process where you can be looking at what neighboring towns are doing and providing comments. So there's an opportunity.
And I would just quickly add that the regional plans can also try and, look at the blocks across municipal boundaries and then do some of its planning to try and encourage coordination among multiple towns. And there's some good examples in Vermont of towns coming together. This happened in the Mad River Valley, and it's happened in Chittenden Uplands area, where towns actually went through a planning process together. Conservation commissions and planning commission members met and had discussions together about looking at where these blocks were located and shared steps of priorities, and then went back to each town's planning process and began working on more of a holistic effort.
Okay. Emily says from CCRPC says we've included ANR's Vermont Conservation Design highest priority forest blocks in our regional plan for the energy planning work. According to the energy planning methodology, this data includes forest blocks connectivity, forest blocks interior, and forest blocks physical and land divisions. Can you please advise if this data layer is enough to cover the needs of Act 171?
Yes. So the term forest blocks in the Act 174 context refers to 3 different data sets: the selection of forest blocks for interior forest conditions, the selection of forest blocks for connectivity values, and physical landscape diversity. And those same 3 data sets certainly do speak to forest resources as well. I would just add wildlife road crossings as that most local scale of from the habitat connector or wildlife corridor standpoint as an additional data set. But yes, those are the go-to data sets to use.
Okay. How can municipalities get assistance from Fish and Wildlife in doing community values mapping, as Jens is describing? Is there an application process?
There's not an application process. Email me.
All right, another one for Jens.
And I'm sorry, I'll just say my services are free or prepaid, depending on how you look at it.
Okay, and the next one is for Jens as well. Could Jens speak to the subjectivity of the data in developing local inventories? Is the data self-reported and therefore less objective or defensible in a town plan or zoning regulation?
I think I understand the question. The data that is available through BioFinder is not subject. It was not self-reported. All of that data comes from A&R field data or models that we've developed. So that is absolutely reliable and usable on the regulatory front. You know, when towns begin to incorporate local data, they certainly can use citizen science data, or they can use data they've hired, that they've gotten from a professional consultant that they've hired. And, you know, if they're using citizen science data or data provided from locals, you know, I would suggest that they do work with the Fish and Wildlife Department or another paid professional to assess whether that local data was done, you know, to a scientifically defensible, in a scientifically defensible methodology before they incorporate it for a regulatory framework. You know, we suggest, particularly around citizen science data for wildlife road crossings, that the town collect at least 3 years worth of citizen science data.
Okay, do we have a definition of the word contiguous? Is there a habitat corridor that is, wait a minute, yeah. Is there a habitat corridor that is too narrow to support wildlife passage?
Yes, there are habitat corridors that are too narrow to support wildlife passage, but how wide it needs to be depends on the species. So you'll get more benefits from a wider corridor than you will from a narrower corridor. I don't have a specific definition for how wide the corridor must be to be considered a corridor, but you know, you get more benefits with wider corridors. So you know, I'd say at least 100 feet total width is as a ballpark would be a functional corridor for a diversity of species. As you get even wider than that, the benefits increase. As you get narrower than that, you know, you'll significantly reduce the number of species that can use it. But again, you know, from the standpoint of a bobcat, that one hedgerow that I showed you earlier was sufficient for that one species to make that short crossing between Shelburne Pond and the forest block. So there are not as many hard and fast rules as we might like, but the wider the better is the take-home message.
Wendy Sue asks if we'll be sending out a PDF of the PowerPoint, and I guess I will comment that I can certainly post the PowerPoint at our website in our event archive, and I can see whether I can post it in the description of the YouTube video when I post that. And I don't know whether you guys will also have it posted somewhere over at A&R.
And A&R, we can post it on that same page that Jamie showed you where the A&R guidance document will be.
Great.
That will be the home for Act 171 planning from the A&R perspective.
And just a reminder that that link does show up earlier in this webinar and in the PDF itself. So if you look at the webinar, you'll be able to see that link. Looks like Jamie's going to go back there and show it to us as well. And then there's actually a comment here from Todd who says his town is not affiliated with a regional planning commission. So his neighboring communities would not get the Act 171 forest planning notice that Claire spoke about, meaning if their town were to update a town plan, their neighboring towns would not receive notice that they were doing so. Which, although I think that's a fairly unusual situation in the state, is probably a good comment, and perhaps the suggestion to Todd is for his town to do the outreach themselves. If they're not part of a regional planning commission, it just might be worth reaching out to their neighbor town. That's just my comment, sorry. You guys should comment as well. And here,
I think that's advised. Yep, that would be a good idea, is just to try and do that outreach, especially if you have a very intact contiguous block that went over multiple municipal town boundaries. It would be a really proactive way to address the planning by having some conversations with adjoining towns.
And that also means that Todd's town wouldn't receive notice about what's going on in the towns around him. So there's another reason for his own town to do that outreach.
Well, I think when the town is going through their own adoption process, irregardless if they're seeking confirmation by the Regional Planning Commission, one of the public notice requirements for a town to adopt its own town plan is that it has to send notice to the adjoining towns.
Okay. Good. All right, I think that's the end of our questions. And thank you for putting up the link to the to that draft document again. And I think, unless you guys have any final comments, I think we can wrap it up and remind everybody that I will be posting the recorded webinar probably this afternoon, maybe first thing Wednesday, but it should be posted fairly quickly at the VCGI YouTube channel.
I also just wanted to say we're going to be doing this again in January, I believe. Is that the date? January 29th, and that'll be from 6 to 7:30. So if there are folks out there who want to see it again or refer that date and time to some of their colleagues maybe working on a conservation commission or a planning commission, that there is going to be 3 more of these live webinars in addition to this webinar being hosted on the web.
Yes, and if anyone needs to see the specifics of those webinars, they are posted on the VCGI website in our calendar. So if you go check out our calendar, you'll see all of those. And there's one in January, one in February, one in March, I believe.
Yeah, and I would just quickly mention that this was the first of 4 webinars, and while we don't have, I guess, a formal way for you all to weigh in with any feedback, we'd love to hear from you. If there was a way that you think we could improve this, or if you have any comments on what was helpful, please, reach out to any of us here on this contact, this last slide here, and share your thoughts.
Great. Thank you very much, you guys.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Have a great day.